to go back to impose quotas and preferences as they once existed in California. Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Now we have Professor Wang. Would you like her to comment on this? You have the microphone.
You know, a lot has been said about the quota, and of course, we know from the previous speakers and from our moderator that quota is not only illegal, but it's also very damaging. And now, I personally have strongly supported the action policy throughout my life, and I'll try to make some explanation. But since the discussion here is really about merit, you know, should universities admit people on the basis of merit alone? And merit usually, historically, defined as your SAT scores and your GPA. A combination of those two factors usually figure prominently in the decision-making process. But of course, it's not all that simple. And SAT has never been proven to be an accurate and reliable predictor of a student performance once they're admitted. What I wanted to say is that, you know, I think American university have gone through several stages of changes in the last 400 some years. You know, beginning with Harvard University, founded around 380 years ago, and from then until 1960s, you know, admissions into the university have always been considered based entirely on merit. And as late as 1960s, only 10% of American population had college degree. So you could see how elitist public education has always been. And you know, the whole process since 60s has been increasing democratization and equalization of access to public education. And I think that's a very important point to make. Also, how did it so happen that before the 60s, so few people got into universities to begin with? Well, you know, if you take a look at Harvard University and all the Ivy League universities, for more than almost 350 years, these universities have only one, you know, admissions policy, and that is affirmative action for white male Protestants. Minorities and women need not apply, and even Jewish people were discriminated by racial quota since the beginning of the First World War until the late 1950s. Finally, the Ivy League University got rid of the Jewish quota. But of course, you know, so I think it's very important to know that merit alone has never been part of university admissions. In fact, as the previous speakers have mentioned, now admissions process is a lot more comprehensive, based on a lot. And in fact, you know, if you take a look at this morning's Associated about World Journal, is this included in this advertisement for this organization called Think Tank Learning. You know, you can see that they are not emphasizing exclusively on SAT and GPA alone. They're talking about, hey, what about sports? You got to do a lot of sports. And what about, you know, special talents, you know, extracurricular activities, show of your leadership quality. All these are the things that are now entering into the consideration. And race, before 2009, was one of the many factors. It used to be, you know, you see, my own institution, and I was ashamed of that. And in fact, I talked to Ward Connolly about during the debate on 2009, that, you know, it's not fair to just single out race alone. I think, what about, you know, the athletes? What about the children of the rich and famous that have always been admitted? By the way, every year, you know, typically Harvard University admits about 500-600 athletes. That means that they're not based entirely on SAT and GPA score. And also about 20 to 30% legacy, so-called legacy student. That means children of wealthy alumni. So, you know, so I think we got to be, when we talk about debates about different kinds of admission policy and criteria that we use, we have to be careful not to buy into the idea that merit alone is the sole criteria that admits a student. Because university nowadays wants to look for people that have potential to become leaders, political, industrial, commercial, cultural leaders of the, of the future of this country. And so there are a lot of criteria that enter into race. And so, but race, because we have been committed to democratizing access to public education, I think it's only fair that admission into the public university, taxpayer-supported university, that they be much more democratic and also more, and providing especially the least fortunate people in our society. We, Asian Americans, were excluded before the 1960s from a lot of universities. And I think fortunately UC has been most generous and fair with dealing with Asian Americans. And so, but even then in the 1980s, as Albert said, I fought my own chancellor for 5 years over the discriminatory policy directed against Asian Americans. I am not in favor of racial quota. I'm not in favor of discriminatory policy, and I will fight that for sure. But I think that we ought to be much more open-minded and view the university as a whole and what the role of university is in terms of educating the future generation, and not just certain races, but all races. Thank you.
Thank you for that. It reminds me of the old lectures by Professor Wang back some 20, 30 years ago, I guess. Yeah, please do be mindful of the time, because we'll have Joe help us to remind people of their time, so we can finish on time and go through all the questions. Thank you. Henry, go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Albert. Thank you very much, everyone, for inviting us to be part of this conversation. And before I make my comments specific to SCA5, I want to just take a moment to thank many of you in the audience who supported our efforts to get the Chinatown City College built back in, approved in 2007. Many of you were part of the 25,000 individuals who signed petition to have that building built, because the Hilton Hotel, with their corporate interests, was trying to block the construction of that facility. So I want to thank you all again for what you have done to support. With regards to SCA5, let me state from the outset that in my review of the measure that's been approved by the State Senate, I think there is room for this amendment to be improved and to be amended further, so that the intent of this amendment holds true to what it hopes to achieve. And from what I can see in the amendment, this amendment really seeks to have the universities to reflect the full diversity of the California high school graduates. And that it seeks, and this is what's interesting about the bill, the original intent that was expressed in the bill in terms of the Legislative Council digest was to implement student recruitment and selection programs that are permissible under the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So the intent was to recruit and to admit students throughout California under the U.S. Constitution with all the U.S. Supreme Court decisions. And as the other panel members have stated, the U.S. Supreme Court does not allow quotas to be applied in university admissions at UC or CSU. So the intent of this resolution is not to impose quotas against any particular racial group. Now, I will take this moment to maybe disagree with one of my fellow panel members in terms of the characterization of UC or CSU admission before the passage of Proposition 209. Before the passage of Proposition of 209 in 1996, there was no quota contrary to what Ward Connerly asserted. Every student who was admitted prior to 2009 during the affirmative action era had to take the A through F courses. They had to take it, they had to reach a certain grade level. And it's same today. Any student who applies to UC and CSU must meet the A through G requirement and reach the GPA. What I find to be the real problem with university admission is not the fight between Asians and blacks and Latinos and white for a limited number of admissions to UC. What is the problem today is our California politicians and ultimately the California public do not want to invest enough money to support the UCs and the CSUs. During the last 2 years, I'll take one more minute, Joel. If you look at the students who were admitted to UC in fall of 2012, there were 72,000 admissions in fall of 2011. Then you fast forward to fall of 2013, there were 82,000 admissions to UC, an increase of 10,000. So there were 10,000 more admissions to UC. Who got them? It wasn't blacks, it wasn't Latinos, it wasn't more Asians or even more whites. Who got them? They were out-of-state students. Not California students, but out-of-state students and foreign students from who knows where. They could have been coming from Asia, Europe, Africa, elsewhere. In other words, we had this huge increase in admission for students who do not come from families that are paying California taxes. Now it is time, and the reason why UC has done that is that they're underfunded. They have gone to out-of-state students and foreign students because they pay more money for tuition.
Okay,
that has to
Henry,
stop.
Let's hold off for now. We're going to have to avoid some time limits, because I was thinking that we will get by without that, but looks like we need to enforce that. However, the first two speakers were respective of time, so you get one question where you can spend more time. How's that? Yeah. So there are many more questions coming. We do want to get out of here on time, especially for those who are standing. The legs are going to get tired before we're done here. I think the format of switching between the pros and cons panel list will be a reasonable thing to try. So the next question I'd like Professor Wang to answer first. What do you think the effect will be specifically on Asian Americans when this, should this pass and becomes a constitution of California?
It's hard to predict because the university, university doesn't just admit people based on certain criteria. The university tries to define what kind of class the next class is going to be, what kind of composition of students that we want to be in there. And then they look for students accordingly. So it's very difficult to predict. Now, but I did make a prediction before 2009 that I thought that I made two predictions actually. I was actually opposed to 2009. Okay? I made two predictions. One, that after 2009 is passed, that the only group that will benefit from the 2009 will be Asian American, not whites, not blacks, not Latino, but Asian Americans. And the reasons for that is very complicated. It has something to do with the correlation between test score GPA and the class background of people, and the Asians seem to be much better represented in that sector, and that's what led me to predict that. But I also predict that within 10 years of the passage that maybe all 9 UC campuses will have more than 50% Asian, at which time there will be clamor at the door for affirmative action program for different type of people. And but of course, that would be wrong to try to impose quota on people. So it's hard to predict at this moment. And also, by the way, I didn't have a chance to talk about it. The SCA5, as it's written, has a lot of problems, and maybe we can get into those problems as we proceed.
Sure, we'll have more time for that. Thank you, Professor Lang. Senator Huff, would you?
Can I respond?
I was going to rotate between, Senator Huff, please answer. What do you think the effect will be specifically on Asian Americans?
And how much time do I have?
One question where you can spend all the time you want.
Well, on the normal, what is it,
2 minutes, please. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I think the effect that it's going to have on Asian Americans is their numbers in the university are going to go down. It's very simple. If you have around 35 to 38% in the UCs or CSUs, in the UC it's higher, and you're taking into consideration race, why in the world do they have to put race in there? And I want to go back. I want to go back. Professor Wong made the comment that it's always been more than merit, but then he listed qualities such as leadership, of volunteering, and some other things. You know what? I would say those are parts of merit. Race is not merit. Race is very specific. It's either like you're in Silicon Valley here. It's either a 1 or a 0, right? You either are or you aren't another race. Why do they have to? And so I think it's pretty simple. The Asian population is going to diminish in our top universities, and I don't think it's fair.
Let's go ahead and Mr. Bird, go on with the next one since we'll rotate between the two.
It's very difficult to tell what may happen with if SCA 5 actually has to be approved by the voters of California. It's more than just the state legislature.
It doesn't matter, we should stop here. People lying.
Please be quiet.
So,
please be respectful.
So it's very difficult to tell, but I have every feeling that it's not going to have, first it needs to be changed. SCA 5 needs to be amended so that it reflects its true intent, and that is to do broad recruitment and outreach of all eligible high school graduates that qualify for UC. I think that is the intent of the bill, and it's not reflected in the current version, and I would be the first, and hopefully others, to work with Senator Hernandez to effect that change. Looking at all the differences among, over time on UC admissions, I don't think whether SCA passes or don't, I think Asian families are very committed to education. And Asian families have shown that they will do whatever is necessary to make their children eligible for UC admission and CSU or private. I'm very confident of that because several years ago, about 5 years ago, we raised questions about the change in freshman admission policy for the fall 2012 class. And we were very concerned about it. We raised concerns, and I think families have responded in kind, have made sure that Asian enrollment admission has maintained at a very high level in spite of the changes. And I feel very confident that Asian Americans can overcome this kind of diversity. What challenges? What I'm really worried about is that as the Asian population grows, especially with Vietnamese, Cambodians, Laotians, and others who may not be as privileged as other community groups, or Asians who are poor, like myself, when I was going through high school, and I did not have high SAT scores. Stanford University selected me, admitted me. My SAT score in verbal was less than 500. If it was purely on so-called merit and grades, I should not have been selected.
Thank you.
On the other hand, if I could just finish, I think that we need to understand why are we under-investing in education. We should not be fighting over crumbs. We need to broaden the opportunities for all students, Asian, Blacks, Latinos,
Thank you,
and
Henry.
even
Yeah, I
white.
think you made that point very well. Thank you. So, okay, I guess we have something in common. My SAT verbal score was also under 500. Mr. Lair.
Yes, let me just respond to a couple points before I respond to your question in particular. First of all, Professor Wang said merit has been defined as GPA and SATs. Well, that was a long time ago. The university now engages in a holistic approach which takes into consideration far more than GPA and SATs, and that's one of the reasons that 37% of the class are Pell Grant eligible students for whom who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. It's a very diverse class that now attends the University of California. With regard to Mr. Durr, if SCA's 5 intent was to allow for recruitment, and that was its aim, the lawyers who drafted it ought to be fired. Then there's not a hint of that. The language is clearly and unambiguously about removing the bar on discrimination from Prop 209. And there is nothing on God's green earth that prevents the University of California today from outreach to all kinds of disadvantaged communities. In fact, the University of California probably leads, the New York Times 6 months ago had an article, leads the entire country in its effort. It spends about $80 million a year on recruitment of disadvantaged kids in communities throughout California in mentoring programs starting at the earliest age. So that they needed a constitutional amendment to be able to do what they've been doing for the past 20 years, it defies logic. As to the impact of SCA 5, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure out that if blacks are 4.3% of the admits and they are 6% of the population, they'd be increased. If Latinos are 27% of the population and are 38% of the population, 27% of the admits, they would probably be increased. That if Asians are 36% of the admits but 13% of the population, that they would probably be decreased. It's a zero-sum game. If you squeeze the balloon here, it's going to come up here. It's got to be taken from someplace. If race is your criterion, and if your logic is that the admission should mirror percentages of the population, there's only one place that the pie is going to be, the slice is going to be narrower, and it's not coming from a whole lot of other communities except this one.
We've expanded on the question, so I think we're going to skip the third question and prepare and go on to the fourth. For those opposed to the bill, can you give us the number 1 and 2 reasons why you take this position? You pretty much have stated some of that, but maybe make it more clear. And also, and are there amendments you believe that can be added that will make this bill more palatable to you and to the constituents, Mr. Lair?
Yeah, I don't think the bill is amendable. Its language is just a disaster. What I find so disturbing about this bill is that if it were passed by the Assembly and goes on the ballot, there will be a campaign in California this fall which will be asking people to allocate, now which ethnic group should get what percentage and what ethnic group, this one should get this percentage. I don't think that's a debate that Californians ought to be having in 2013 about between ethnic and racial groups. We're not talking about taxes. We're not talking about goldfish in San Francisco Bay. We're talking about futures of your children. And that is a visceral, basic issue that people get passionate about, and that will be a very, very nasty campaign. I don't think these folks knew what they were doing. I don't think they really want to take that tiger by the tail, because it'll be a disastrous and nasty and vicious campaign, and I don't think Californians deserve it or need it.
Thank you.
I think it's wrong to assume that if this bill passes, that there will be the effort on the part of the university will be to reach racial parity based on population. University would never agree to that, because
We can try.
Please be quiet.
because sees itself as competitive with Stanford, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, they will never at any moment compromise their academic reputation. Okay?
Let's let Professor Wayne speak, please.
I
Okay.
think, the reason why we are having this problem today is that UC has not been keeping up in terms of its growth with the pace of the population growth. In 1960s, when UC built 4 new campuses to make it 9 campuses altogether, it was projecting into a future of growth. And so the California state economy needed more UC graduates. Now, if you and at that time, the population of California is only 15 million. If you fast forward to today, population of California is now 38 million. Have we increased comparable number of UC campuses? No. And that's why, I think it's getting harder and harder to get into UC. And on top of that, as Andy mentioned, we're using out-of-state students and foreign students to raise, treating them as cash cow, to raise more money, and thereby displacing a lot of California taxpayer, and I think that's wrong. So if you ask me, what can we do in terms of amending the SCA5, there's plenty of room for amendment. Number one, I think, since there's so much concern about racial quota, I would say that we should make it very explicit that under no circumstance would we condone racial quota. Number two, I think we should set it the limit.
Please.
We used to, you see, in my campus, used to limit the number of out-of-state students to less than 10% and foreign students less than 4%. I think that we ought to go back to that kind of limit, and perhaps something along that language could be put into the amendment to allow more California residents to send their children to the UC system.
Thank you, Professor Wayne. Senator Huff.
Open your eyes, see who
Please.
is representing.
So first of all, there's a lot of talk about how to amend this. It can't be amended, folks. Right now, this bill talks about it simply removes the word race from how we conduct our application, our admissions. And when you take away that, how do you amend it? I don't know. I don't think it can be amended. Why I'm against this, there's 2 things. First, it seems to go against the very founding principles of this country. In the Declaration of Independence, says we hold these truths to be self-evident. Everybody could recognize it on its own. We should hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I would argue that education is a part of that pursuit of happiness that you have for yourself and for your children. That's a right. We were founded on this. There's a lot of talk here that's merging public universities and private. We've talked about Stanford, we've talked about Harvard, Yale. I can't do anything about them, but as a state legislator, I can do something about our policies for our public universities here that you and I pay taxes for. So from my perspective as a policymaker, we want to reward those that work hard. We want to reward the brightest and the best. And when we do that, we don't gut the system. If you don't reward the brightest and the best, pretty soon your kids are going to say, why am I working hard when it doesn't make a difference to get into school? Apple Computers did not become the #1 business in the world by hiring dummies. They didn't. And we could go on, but I think it strikes at the heart of what we want to do to encourage the best and the brightest. California competes globally, not just with other states.
With all due respect to Senator Huff, he says, California should be about rewarding those who work hard and who are the brightest. Unfortunately, California is not doing that right now, even before this amendment is considered or adopted. Why? When my 3 children went through the UC system, they were part of the they were part of the top 12.5% that were guaranteed admission to UC if they met the A through G requirement, took the test, and got the GPA. Today, UC only guarantees admission for the top 9%. That's less than the master plan. So I say to our politicians, I say to other policymakers, why are we lowering the guarantee for all the high school students who are working hard? Why? Because they refuse to raise more revenues to support UC and open up opportunities for all those students, white, black, Asian, and Hispanic, who have taken the A through G courses and have gotten the requisite GPA. It's appalling. So we are giving a false claim to maybe some of your students and all other students across California. When I was at the Department of Ed, we said we want our high school students to take more rigorous courses. We want them to pass the high school X exam. The data is there. Every racial group has had more students meet these challenges, but they are now seeing less opportunity at UC because our politicians refuse to put the revenues into UC.
Thank you.
And we need to have more revenues.
Thank you, Mr. Chris. Okay, just a matter of, please, if you cannot control yourself, please excuse you from the hall. There's a protest outside, you can join the crowd there and vent all you want. I must say that to be respectful of our panelists, you can imagine for Professor Wang and Mr. Durr to come here, to knowing that they will likely face a hostile crowd, takes a lot of courage. So if you please give them encouragement rather than knock yourself down. And Dr. Senator Huck has asked for his extra time that he has earned earlier to respond to this question.
Thank you. Actually, I think it is apples and oranges. If there was a promise made in the 60s that we would offer the top 12% or so, and it's down now to 9.5, it still begs the question, how are we going to determine who the 9.5 has? How do you do it? And so that is going to negatively impact those that are overrepresented now, and that's the Asian community, if you're deciding by race. When it comes to us not funding higher education enough, let's be very clear about that. The fastest growing segment in the state budget has been higher education. We don't control the UC, the University of California. And so when their costs rise rampantly, and we make a lot of noise about, we sometimes think they're paying some people too much. When they give tenure to universities and they have no accountability, or they give tenure to professors, and then they have no accountability to rein them in or whatever, they just keep paying them. We have a very robust UC system. I love that system. I think it produces a lot of good things. But the state doesn't have a whole lot of control, and it is the single largest growing factor in the state budget. So they pass it on to the students. It used to pay a lot more of that education. Now we're subsidizing somewhere around 40 or 50% of it. And to answer that other question about the foreign students, yeah, they started bringing foreign students in more because they pay 100%, not just half, like we do for everybody else that's here. And it also gave us a more diverse student body population. But don't forget, Prop 30 was passed, and I'm normally not partisan in something like this, but the governor and other Democrats said, if you pass Prop 30, and many of you in this room did, that money will go to education. We've done the minimum guarantee under Prop 98 of about 40% going to education. The rest went to pay off debt. The rest went to grow government. They went to salaries for the bureaucrats in Sacramento. It didn't go to education. So there was money right there that should have gone to the students that voted for Prop 30 in the first place. There's never enough money, but we can do a lot better with what we have.
Thank you, Senator Huck. I see a lot of questions coming my way, which is great. Everybody's interested in this subject, but of course there are too many to ask. But I will include some of these in the questions I have prepared, as well as kind of collate some of them into one single question. So if your question is not asked specifically, please excuse there's not enough time, or you may have been asking other questions. So the next question, which is part of mine and part of many audiences' questions, is the legal challenge to this, since there has been multiple legal cases regarding affirmative action over the last 40 years or so, and there has been challenges to Proposition 209. There will be no doubt challenges to this particular proposition as well, should it pass. Can we have an opinion from someone here, or everybody here? What do you think is going to happen once it goes to the court? Let's start with the lawyer, Mr. Lear.
I prefer to think that it doesn't pass, it doesn't become law. I'm not sure how the courts would interpret it. Prop 209 has been litigated in several instances, and in each case it was found to be constitutional. I'm not sure that a law, in fact, some of the legal precedent which suggests you can't go from non-discrimination to discrimination might in fact undercut the viability of SCA5 because you're going from non-discrimination to saying you can allow discrimination. So I'm not sure how it would go. You can't predict. I'd much prefer to think that it doesn't become law, doesn't become passed by the state and citizens of California. We don't face that issue.
Yeah, there is no question in my mind that if SCA5 were approved by the voters of California, and then the UC system were to impose quotas, I would be first in line to file a lawsuit with everybody else. I'm against quotas. In fact, there's one point I want to raise. Right now, even under the current version of this bill, which needs to be improved and is flawed, there is no word in here that states quota that's used by Senator Hernandez. It's only a description that Mr. Lear has used. There is no language in SCA5 that says there's going to be a quota against Asians. Let me finish. Let me finish. There is no language in SCA5 that says parity, so that if Asians are only 13% of the California population, then only UC admittees will be 13% of the total. There's nothing in there. And that's why we need to look at this in a rational way, look at the intent, work with State Senator Hernandez to make sure that it is what it is intended to do. Again, as what Professor Lynch stated, and I share his sentiment, I'm against quotas. I would hope that Senator Hernandez will actually reinsert, this is something that I'm not sure if Mr. Lear has talked about. He says, well, I have read the language that it was stricken out. There is intent language here that was amended out that needs to be brought back and perfected. So contrary to what he has asserted, there is the word recruitment in the intent language. And I think that that's why I urge all of you to look at the bill very carefully, what was originally in the bill, what was stricken, what it is now, and I think as it goes through the assembly, there needs to be a thoughtful discussion about how this bill needs to be.
Thank you, Mr. Durr. Senator Huff, any comments?
I'm not an attorney, but it seems to me attorneys would find a way to litigate it. They always do, right? But I would say, regardless of whether it's got quota in there, let's go back to the simple fact, there's only so many slots available, whether it's 9% or 12.5%. If Asians have a disproportionately higher number than their population now, they're going to have a much lower number, whether it's through quota or recruitment or whatever you want to call it. As soon as you introduce race as a criteria that you can make a decision by, it's going to have an adverse reflect on somebody. It doesn't take a rocket scientist, as was said before.
Another question, very important to myself, and this had kind of been bothering me a lot, is SCA5 eliminates public education from the protection under Proposition 209. Does not mention anything about contracting and employment. From an Asian American perspective, we have faced, as all of you probably know here, I see mostly middle-aged people sitting here, career bamboo ceilings, we call it glass ceilings in the American way, bamboo ceiling when it refers to Asians in promotions, employment, and also in public contracting is basically an old boys network that our companies have not been able to break into. Would you comment on why do you think it's only schools that's excluded from this on SCA5? Would it be helpful to include contracting and employment as well to amend the Constitution and therefore be having a level field for everybody? Let's see. We'll have Mr. Later started twice. Well, Professor Wang, please.
Well, I'm not the author of the bill, and in fact, I did engage Senator Fernandez as Chief of Staff and his person in charge of education legislation that this past Tuesday went up to Sacramento to talk to them, to ask them why, those were, were excluded, and, didn't really give me a good answer, other than that, the reason why public education is included is so that, you could, the university can then do more extensive outreach and recruitment, early on from the elementary school all the way up. So I really am very, very much at a loss about why the bill is fashioned in that way. Maybe Senator Harvard.
Yeah, I don't pretend to understand Senator Ed Hernandez's mind. But I would say he didn't include it because Prop 209 was passed by the people, and typically when you take on tough battles, you try to limit the scope of it. I don't think he nearly anticipated the adverse reaction in the Asian community to what he did take on, however. When it comes to public contracting, things like that, we do have a lot of federal laws that are involved in that, as well as state laws, and I think we've come a long way in equality for who gets things. I know when I was on a public project doing grade separations in Southern California, I found out we had to have a certain percentage of disadvantaged business enterprises, which are owned by minorities. You get certain points, if they were female, if they're Asian, if they had to represent the community that the jobs were being in. And so I know there are some very significant laws on the books that require us to be not just giving good old boys that are, normally build the bar down the street, but, as far as why Ed didn't put that in there, I think he was just trying to be strategic and keep us focused narrow so that it wouldn't go beyond our admission policies in schools.
Thank you, Senator. What, Mr. Durr, please respond next. Of course, always feel free if you have nothing to say when you go on to the next question.
Yeah, it sort of befuddles me about how the bill got amended. In fact, there is one provision in the new version that was adopted by the state senate that, for example, it says state does not include the University of California or the public school system. That to me is really strange because K-12 education is totally state funded, and we should always treat K-12 education as a state function. I am a little bit frustrated with this discussion because I really think at the end of the day, it comes down to money. And with all due respect to the senator, I disagree with his assessment about the UCs in terms of its had the largest rate of increase in its budget. Well, the reason why it may have had an increase in its budget due to some Prop 39 support, Proposition 30 support, is that during the tough years, higher education was severely slashed. Your students today are paying much more tuition than when my children went through the UC system. And for many, and we should not pretend that every Chinese family is well-to-do and comes from a professional background. There are many low-income Asians who are struggling in trying to get into UCs. And with regards to Mr. Laird's point, that, you know, there's great diversity and that a lot of Pell Grants. If you look at recent data of the UC admittees in the fall 2013 class, the proportion of low-income students went down. The proportion of students who were admitted coming from families who had no college graduates is going down. So these are very negative trends, and I think we should be mindful of what kind of diversity that we seek to achieve. It's well beyond race.
Please wrap up, yeah. So fair to everybody else for the time. Okay, Mr. Lair,
I haven't looked at data recently, but I think the UCs continue to be leading the entire country in the diversity of their student body vis-a-vis socioeconomic status. If it went down, it may have gone down 0.5%, but 37% at UCLA, 30-something% at Berkeley, 30-something% at virtually every one of the other schools. It has been, they have received accolades over the past year by the New York Times and other papers because they've simply done a stellar job of recruiting without diminishing the quality of their admits by recruiting poor kids. It's just, it's unprecedented any place else in the country. There isn't a public university, let alone a private university, that comes close to doing what the UCs are doing. And you keep talking about some other version of SCA5. I mean, you know, it could have been the Declaration of Human Rights, but it isn't. SCA5 is a travesty, and I don't know what other versions existed, but the version I have in front of me would be a disaster, and its pre-existing conditions are all dead on arrival. This is the one that we have to deal with, and I think you know, to talk about what existed before is just you know, not on point.